This is Journey of an Aesthete podcast. I'm Mitch Hampton, and we are delighted to have with us Ericka Verba, correct?
Yes.
I pronounced it correctly. I'm always worried about getting the guest name named right. You are here for many reasons. I mean, it's actually in this episode is going to be, if I may speak a little bit up front, and then we'll start talking, conversation, kind of a celebration or a of Violeta Parra, right?
Yes.
Who is sort of in many ways a symbol of Chile, Chilean music and Chilean politics, activism, art, painting, folklorista, and many things. Of course, I've read your book. You have a new book out called "Thanks to Life." Gracias a vida loca. Vida what? What is it? Gracias.
Gracias a la vida. La vida loca. That's the other famous song by. That's another one.
A la vida. And I have before we start talking about her and your project, which again, first of all, I really enjoyed your book.
Well, thank you.
The other thing about your book that isn't always the case when I read a book is I learned an enormous amount. A lot I did not know.
Wow.
And so that was really, I really appreciate that. I mean, I learned a lot about folk music. I learned a lot about Latin America. I learned a lot about Chile. I mean, my only real experience with Chile, of course, is with the political, I guess probably the movie Missing was my first as a 14-year-old. Costa Gavras' film about Pinochet, Junta, and remember that film, Jack Lemmon. And also I'd come across in the library in Florida in the early 80s, 82, some unclassified documents about IT&T and Kissinger in Chile. And at that time in my life, I was much more political than I am now. So those were the kinds of things I was interested in. I was very hopeful and sympathetic about Allende at that time. And that's part of her story in a way, but in a way, her story is much older than that, right? Because when I take this book, it's the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s.
Yes.
And the 60s is really her central, 50s and 60s are her central decades, right? And
yeah.
But since she's such a as you said, we throw around these days versatile.
Yeah.
And Renaissance woman and these kinds of things, but she really is right. Wouldn't you say exhibit A of somebody that really worked in many mediums and in a comprehensive manner? And then she's also in a way an historian of her country. So where do you want to begin? I mean, there's your story too. Of course, in the episode, I want to talk about how you came to love and study this figure, and also your background in music or anything you want to talk about. So I've talked too much, so we'll go over to you.
This is really fantastic. And I want to talk about all of these things as well. And I feel what I love about your podcast is you actually take the time to do all of this. So I feel like we're going to get to everything. Yeah. Why don't I start with Violeta Parra? Because I know that the focus of this podcast is sort of on creativity and art. And and again, we do throw these words around, but this woman was a creative genius. I mean, there's just no other way to describe her, I would say. Oh, yeah. And she did start. So just for your listeners, to know, and maybe they can even pause the podcast and just go Google her, because you can see her visual image. You can see her art if you do that. And you can also hear her voice in some of her pieces. But well, I'll start with the most well-known song and then I'll back up. Right. So my book takes its title from Gracias a la Vida, which is her most well-known song. The translation is Thanks to Life, and that's the title of my book. And that song has outlived Violeta Parra, now by some good 50 years. And it's been recorded by literally hundreds of artists. Most recently, Casey Musgrave, who's country. Right. Here in the United States, but also Yo-Yo Ma did an instrumental version on this beautiful CD he put out for music to soothe us during COVID. And also Joan Baez. Well, Joan Baez, everyone now knows who Joan Baez. We all know who Joan Baez.
Right. Well, Joan Baez was fortunate to meet.
I don't know if she met her, but she actually recorded an album in '72 when Allende was still president, called Gracias a la Vida. So she helped to make the song very famous as well, as did the Argentine singer Mercedes Sosa. And that's just a small list. I think Placido Dominguez also recorded it, and Omar Portuondo from the Buena Vista Social Club. So, and I can go on and on. I mean, because I kind of collect the versions. I think it's a lot of fun.
Hold that thought, because I realize now after reading your book that I had seen this film on the big screen from 2013. You know the film I'm talking about, Goes to Heaven.
Yes. Which is
So
one take on her. It's a take on her from very much influenced by her son.
Yeah.
And I do think it emphasizes her mental illness, and we can talk more about that as well, which often, as we know, mental challenges and creativity sometimes go together. In her case, I would say, I mean, I don't know. I'm a historian, so I don't want to be a psychiatrist. I don't know. I mean, I'm not putting this one on the couch.
Well, they are different disciplines, although there is another psychohistory comes in.
Yes, but I'm not trained in that. I would say this. So as a historian, I don't like to diagnose her with a disease that wasn't known at the time, because it doesn't make any sense. It's not how her life was lived.
Well, it's an anachronism. It's an anachronism.
Yeah, it's an anachronism. So when she was alive, people basically thought she was difficult. And I think one psychiatrist did diagnose her with depression, and they gave her barbiturates. I think, were she alive today, it's very possible she would be diagnosed as bipolar.
You say that in the book.
Yeah, because she had these incredible highs. Like, she would get up when she was active, she would be up at 4 a.m. and go to bed at midnight. And the most productive. I mean, this woman is prolific. She wrote 200 songs. She made tapestries. She made paintings. And I'll come back to all of that. And she also could get in bed and never get out. So, both of those two things. And she committed suicide, which is clearly evidence of mental illness, probably the most obvious, or determining. But going back to sort of this creative force that she was. So her most famous song is Gracias a la Vida, but she literally wrote hundreds of songs. When she began singing, very young. She sang all sorts of popular songs that people would sing in bars to make a living. And she wrote songs within those styles. She wrote boleros, and she wrote corridos from Mexico, because, the Mexican cinema was big in Chile. Small country. And so she wrote rancheras, and she did all of that. And then she had this turn where she embraced folklore, and I'll come back to that. And then she'd write songs that sounded like folk songs. Then in the end of her life, she just completely took off and began making her own creations. That drew on folklore, that drew on certain elements of Chilean culture, but that truly transcended it as well. And that's just the songs. But so if you want to see the creative genius, I really recommend that your listeners go to, and your viewers, I guess, yes, as well, go to this piece called L-E-L, like the in Spanish, Gavilan, which means sparrowhawk. So G-A, V as in Victor, I-L-A-N. And what it is it's an experimental piece for guitar.
Yeah, it's great.
Atonal. You've heard it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and it was meant to be, she had this elaborate idea that it would be a folk ballet, and that she would be the lead singer, and it would have all the folk instrumentation, orchestra, but also a full symphony, and she'd have a choir behind her. I mean, she had really grandiose creative ideas. No one was thinking of folk ballets in the 60s. This was, I mean, she was in the early 60s. This was a very revolutionary idea. And, that she would bring in, the modern dance troupe from Chile. She's just, and if you listen to this piece, it's 12 minutes long.
Yeah,
it's phenomenal. It's just, and this is a woman who does not know how to read music and has never studied formal composition ever. So that's just the breadth and sort of her musicality. She could play any.
She invented her own makeshift kind of notation, right?
Absolutely. Sometimes, it was drawings, which brings me to, and she for her, the visual arts and music were completely linked. So at one point she says, she says that she draws, every song is a painting waiting to be painted. Yeah. And then she kind of flipped it at one point. She also talked about how her melodies were drawings. But anyway, she was just, and so to get to her visual art, she doesn't become a visual artist until late in life. It's 1959. So she must have been 42. She has hepatitis, and the doctor says she can't get out of bed, and she starts
drawing,
painting and making these incredible embroideries, tapestries, they'll call them tapestries, embroidered tapestries.
Right.
And she ends up being the first Latin American artist to have a solo show in the Museum of Decorative
Oh,
Arts in Paris, which is housed in the Louvre. And that is really shown in that movie that you're mentioning,
right.
the Violeta Goes to Heaven.
Kevin, you know.
So a woman who can do, and she did sculpture, she did embroidery, she did pottery, she did sculpture, she did wire sculptures, she did oil paintings. And then at the end of her life, what I truly love, she opened this big kind of circus tent in a sort of a folk music club center there. And she, as she said in one interview, she has mastered the culinary arts. So she would cook, and she would cook traditional Chilean food. And that was another art form for her. So she really was incredibly creative, and her work has endured. Two of her tapestries were shown at the Venice Biennial, which is, I guess, one of the most important art shows in the world.
Yep.
In 2022.
Yep.
So there's a real one of the purposes of writing my book, Thanks to Life, was precisely so that more people could know her, because she's just, those who do discover her go, oh my God, why didn't I know about this before?
Right. Well, probably my first encounter with her, but not knowing it was her, it was Bernstein's Mass.
Yes.
Her Mass, which uses her song, right? So
yes. And it was written it was commissioned by Jacqueline Kennedy.
That's right.
For the opening of the Kennedy Center.
1972,
Yeah.
72.
Yeah. My book has a wonderful quote about how he stole it.
Well, he was probably, I'd imagine he was more ethical than Les Baxter. Do you want to talk about what happened?
Oh yeah, Les Baxter. Yeah, both. So Bernstein. Let me see. I have my book here, so I can look in the index.
Right. Well, that's really. I was shocked. I mean, I wasn't shocked that I mean, none of it's shocking, but it's just something I didn't know.
Well, actually, the song he stole was I mean, he does say it. I mean, he says it very cleverly in an interview, but he does say it. But it was a folk song, so it wasn't hers. He took the theme from a folk song. Right. I know, it's going to be in the notes. So he takes the theme from a folk song she collected that she recorded, and he had the album 358 number 34. But in the interview, I mean, he's very tongue in cheek. What does he say in the interview? He says,
Les Baxter, yeah.
No, this is not Les Baxter. I'll do Les Baxter was worse. So Bernstein says the song, and he's talking about this, the Mass, this part of this Mass, is based, almost stolen, from the Chilean folk music by Violeta Parra. It's an album of Violeta Parra. Yeah. I could play you part of it, and you'd be astonished at the similarity. You'd say, but that's a direct steal. And you'd be right. But Les Baxter, who is this exotica band leader of the 50s, he just stole her song. He he made it into an instrumental. He recorded it on Around the World with Les Baxter, and he forgot to give her any royalty credits. So she took him to court, and she got the credits, and he called it Melodia Loca. That's probably where you got the Loca part, and which means crazy melody.
No, it's a habit because Allison Anders film. Do you know Allison Anders, the filmmaker?
No.
Your film Vida Loca.
Yeah. Well, that
was doing. It's from the early '90s. It's a great film if you haven't seen.
Oh, that's good. I'll have to go check it out. Anyway, the melody. Anyway, she builds a house on with the money that she prefabricated wooden house. Very simple, but it's a house.
Well, it's really remarkable. I mean, so the thing I wanted to also put a spotlight on, because it's something that one of the things I learned because I didn't know. She has an interesting journey. Now, she starts off doing sort of gigging musician.
Yeah.
And what she would consider commercial music in the 40s, right? Yeah. 40s to early 50s, with her siblings, right? And these kind of campesino and this kind of is the but that's a certain very particular style of music, right? It's what's considered commercial and popular.
Yeah.
That people loved right at that time. Yeah. But didn't she have sort of a kind of a revelation where she turned against that in a way? And but that turning against that I think was connected to her becoming an historian. And that's when she goes on the road interviewing people. Do you want to talk about who informants are and who she was talking with and what she was studying, or that's a whole topic?
But yes, no. So before she kind of has this creative explosion where she takes her art wherever she wants it to go, her
Right.
first kind of shift from, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't have written a book and no one would know who she was if she had remained a barroom singer in Chile playing this kind of
Right.
music called
That's it.
typical music. Música típica was the kind of music that immigrants from the countryside to the city listened to. It had
Right.
folk roots, but it was commercialized.
Right.
And, you know, they sang on the radio. They were called the Parra sisters. Think of the Andrews sisters. You know, it was like a thing, right? And then that what happens, and they're recorded by RCA Victor.
Right. Right.
And what happens, you know, but just singles, like
Sure.
they're playing a kind of music that's very popular.
When I use the word commercial, I'm not making a normative statement, actually.
No.
I'm trying to be technical and saying this was music people listened to. This was like
Yeah.
top 40 parade in that
Absolutely.
country.
It's not a judgment. It was how she made a
Right.
living.
It's just a style. Now for her, it became a judgment for her because
Yeah.
she had
It's
other
what-
ambitions and other
Well,
goals.
what happens is she goes out into she becomes part of this sort of movement of people. There's a folk song revival in Chile, and it's happening really all over the world. The equivalent in the United States might be the Weavers, Woody Guthrie,
Joan Baez.
Joan Baez. Well,
Right.
actually, I don't know if Joan Baez collected. I'm thinking of peteseeger,
Alan
alanlomax, the people that kind of. She
Right.
was a collector and a folk singer. So the idea was you'd go out and you learn the old songs and then you perform them. But the important thing and why it's kind of happening all over the world at that time, one of the reasons is because the songs are literally dying out. So when radio, you know, happens, and then radio and also records, people stop learning songs through oral tradition. They start learning them from the radio or from records. And so they're all kind of the same song. You try to replicate it, right?
You try to replicate the correct version.
Yes, there's only one version and that's it. But and it's completely changes also how we make music. And she's going out and collecting from the old people in the countryside, from, you know, elderly people, these old songs that have been handed down through the generations. So there's different versions in different towns, and we can chase some of them back to, you know, the medieval Spain. You know, she collects ballads about Carlo Magno, who's Charlemagne, right? Like he's a medieval conqueror from France. You know, it's like, and she can find these songs and they're pretty phenomenal. And that becomes one of her passions. She's just in love with this music, and she wants Chile to see that Chile has a culture beyond the commercial culture, and that it's deep and it's rich. And she's very successful at that. But from that kind of experience of collecting folk music, she gets invited to a festival in Europe, which is actually organized by the Soviet Union. It's called the World Festival of Youth and Students. That's how a lot of Latin American musicians end up going to Europe at the time. And when she's in Europe, she ends up, she plays in the Soviet bloc. She plays in Warsaw. I think she tours a little bit. She tours Czechoslovakia.
That's right.
And, you know, you can't make a living in the Soviet bloc as a musician because it's not that kind of place. So, like, virtually every musician who got to Europe by playing on the Eastern Bloc, she makes her way to Paris. And she ends up living there for 2 years. And Paris in the 50s it's just amazing. Like, you know, she's living in the Latin quarter, the Quartier Latin, and, you know, as one of the musicians describes that she plays with, you know, you go to the cafe and there's Simone de Beauvoir having coffee with, you know, Sartre, and you know, she plays in a bar where Gabriel Garcia Marquez is playing because he's trying to make money so he can finish his novel. You know,
well, I think it was Scala, correct?
What's that? L'escale. It's called L'escale, the stopover. Yeah. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he's the one who called he calls Paris the capital of Latin America. That's what he describes it as in the 50s. I mean, everyone is there. I can go on the number of visual artists, and she's completely, you know, involved with all of them. And even the kind of music she ends up playing, or that becomes known as sort of Chilean new song, you can hear the roots that this or Latin American protest music from the 60s. You can see how it comes out of Paris in a strange way, in that they mix up all of the instruments of Latin America. They take the Venezuelan cuatro and they put it together with the Andean quena, which is this bamboo flute. The cuatro is a small guitar with 4 strings. That's why it's called cuatro. And, you know, they'll take the Colombian tiple, which has a triple strings, and they'll put them all together. And that can happen in Paris in a club called L'Escale, because all the musicians are there. But it's not happening in Bolivia or Venezuela or Colombia, because that's not where the musicians meet, right?
Right. Well, it's interesting because that's of course a time, the 50s of when politics, or the after the popular, the victory of World War II, or the popular, that's the Popular Front. And there's that holdover where I guess aesthetics and politics were very united. There wasn't really, and so people in Paris were very people who were artists were committed, like Louvrepalace and Sartre and like Violeta. They were committed to seeing Soviet Union as an example, probably as an alternative to the capital, what they would call the capitalist imperialist West. I'm sure U.S. And
they were naive. I mean, well, let's be clear.
Sure.
They were dreamers. They thought that it was an alternative. The other alternative was, and she was also kind of embodied it, was they other people took up the indigenous, sort of the spirituality. They were just very along with this kind of economic post-World War II boom, this economic boom. I think in French they call it les 30 glorieuses, 3 decades of economic growth. Every family now can have a washing machine, kind of thing, just like in the United States. Almost alienation, because buying things doesn't make you happy, right? And so they're very like, what is our purpose? And they're searching for it. Some people take up existentialism. Other people take on the Andean flute, and they become spiritual.
But I guess the thing, I'm looking at it from the point of view of people then, and forgetting I'm not pretending, but we're not dealing with the revelation. We're not talking about the Khrushchev revelations or the invasion of Hungary. We're just dealing with this brief period when there was a Marxist left that was also aesthetically conscious and interested in folk music, interested in indigenous culture, and she is that in those years.
Absolutely.
And of course, as you know, having written a book, she has a long quarrel with the CP, although she's involved with the CP. But like many people in the party, she argues with the party, and
the rigidity, their idea of what art should be was so rigid at the time.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and then, the other side of it, I mean, there was a cultural Cold War. So the United States is promoting, ironically, it's promoting modern art, because modern art's universal, right? So they're like, so
Jackson Pollock, right.
Yeah.
Jackson Pollock is
and they're promoting jazz, which, in the 50s in particular, both in the 50s and the 60s, is absolutely kind of completely paradoxical because of the way we treat African Americans in the United States at the time. So, Jim Crow and jazz together, they just don't. Promoting jazz as American music, but they definitely did that. They would send the State Department sent Dizzy Gillespie on a world tour.
Yeah, Mike Longo, pianist. Yeah, but that's I mean, that's an interesting period. I mean, of course, the promotion of abstract expressionism and the promotion of bebop or modern jazz, or Dizzy Gillespie and Dave Brubeck. I mean, there's I'm always mindful of the fact that these are quite something as creative accomplishments, and that's somewhat separate from the voting or the politics, although that plays a role. The CIA and Encounter magazine and all that in the 50s and 60s. But it's interesting, her journey, because she's probably, how many people did she visit? Probably for how many years did she go on travel in all these countries, towns and countrysides, talking to all these different musicians, all these different people, and she's recording all those experiences, right?
Yeah.
And all of those experiences, she's collecting them. It's influencing her own art making, right? It's also influencing her decision making, right, about what to do with her life and her career. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think she has all of these stages of sort of her creative growth. And while she's a folklorista, which is this this collector of folklore, and then the singer. Because folklorist in Spanish, folklorista, has this double meaning of both being a collector and a folk singer. So she's kind of Alan Lomax, and the U.S. equivalent would be Alan Lomax and Woody Guthrie rolled into one person, right? Although I think I'm sure Alan Lomax also performed. He was with his Ramblers. So Alan Lomax is probably the best example that he both learned the music, and he recorded the music, and he performed it. And also, he's a great example because she met him. She met him in the 50s. So these folk revivals were connected. And the reason she met him was because she went to London. It was recorded by the BBC. And Alan Lomax was in London because of McCarthyism. So the other thing is that folk music was absolutely part of the Cold War. The Weavers were blacklisted.
I'm sure the Weavers had met her, right? I'm sure she knew Ronnie.
No, because she never made it to the States. So
Oh,
Alan is really the only U.S. folk revivalist that she met. So she met. She was interesting. So in Chile, she met, I would say she probably collected songs from over 200 sources. So they were called folk sources, right? Folk,
that's
what are they
right.
called? Folk informants, right? That's what the
Well,
anthropologists, she never called them anything.
in the book, you use the term informant, so I
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah. So that's what the academic speak would call it, right? She wasn't an academic, so she just
No,
called them mis viejitos, my old guys, my old folks, right?
her
She
people.
called them my old folks, and she was anti-academic, but you know,
But,
the language of the time would be folk informants, folk sources, and she probably met 200 of them over her life, or recorded about 200. So she would go everywhere. She learned how to ride horses so she could
oh
reach
yeah,
people. She would, she mule, horse, truck, whatever it took. She was very, very stubborn woman with very few resources, so she did whatever it took to get
sure.
where she needed to be. So there's that, but then also she just met because of who she was, and because she was an interesting person, right? And because she kind of symbolized authentic Chile, folk Chile, rural Chile, this culture that, when you were in modern consumer mass culture,
Right.
would seem like a respite from all of
Yes, all that.
everything. Yeah, a respite.
Sure.
So she did meet Leonard Bernstein. She met Allen Ginsberg.
Oh yeah,
She met, those are the most famous from the United States. Maybe in France, she wanted to meet Picasso. She never did, but she met, pretty much every Latin American musician that was there at the time.
yeah.
So she was, she was really sort of involved in her times, which I think is an
Oh yeah.
important thing to recognize, because a lot of people wanted to sort of romanticize her and make her seem like she's sort of this pure folk artist who somehow magically appears in Paris, which is not how the world works. You don't magically get anywhere, really.
Well, that's yeah. I mean, she was involved in her world.
Yeah,
Is a
exactly. She
creature
wasn't
of it.
outside of time. Yeah.
Well, but so interestingly enough, yeah. But she achieved a kind of on some would say an eternal because you could almost say she is Chile, or she felt she represented Chile,
Yeah.
represented her country.
Yeah.
And she would, I'm sure she would say faithfully and authentically that what that word means to her.
So those were
Of
her
course,
goals.
of course, in your book, you're critical of it as a pure. You say that I think there's a passage in the book where you said there's a pitfall if
Yeah.
an artist chooses authenticity because of the vagaries of historical change, or because it's slippery, or explain that.
It's a slippery slope. That's a great way to put it. So let's say well, I use the contrast with her brother. Her brother is this amazing poet. His name is Nicanor Parra, and he's recognized as a modern poet,
That's
right?
right.
He lived to 104, which is a contrast.
Oh,
Violeta
wow.
Parra committed suicide at 49, and he's been recognized as a poet. He's received the Cervantes Prize, which is the greatest prize you can get in the Spanish language. It's like it's the Spanish language Nobel Prize in literature. He's phenomenal. And he
Really?
was really allowed to be a modern poet, even though he drew from folk. He drew on folk themes just like she did. And she really wasn't allowed to. She was kind of pigeonholed because of her gender and her lack of education. So she had to sort of represent this other kind of pure, authentic Chile that had no sophistication and no intentionality, right? She was like, they would compare to a wild flower that blooms in a field, and her music was her art, all of her art was completely spontaneous, like a child. So they really took away the power of intentionality of her artistry, and that's really, I think, very gendered and classist, because she was not very educated. And I think that the pigeonhole part is, if your promise is that you're going to give something that's very real to people,
That's
well,
right.
first of all, there's what people love about authenticity is that excitement of discovery. Oh my God, I just discovered Violeta Parra, but that wears off. So next week you're going to want to discover somebody new. Oh, I just discovered this Indonesian artist that makes puppetry, right? So you're kind of the flavor of the month when you're authentic.
That's
And the
right.
other thing is, if you get too popular or too well known, you're not authentic anymore, right? Because everyone else knows about you. So now you're just like another person. And so there were a lot of, and it
Very,
also, yeah,
the
it could
word, the
be,
word go. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You were gonna.
no. It just, it's hard to maintain authenticity, because if you become too famous, you're no longer authentic, right?
Yeah.
And also because our notions of authenticity changed. So in the 1950s, when she presented this folk music, that was considered authentic. In the 1960s, there's this music, there's these, what they call them, one of the scholars that I read called them guitar poets. They're Bob Dylan, they're Victor Jara in Chile, they're Violeta Parra in Chile, they're Georges Brassens in Paris.
Right.
And they're wearing, I mean, they're wearing leather jackets and they have turtlenecks. They're a certain, so the authenticity becomes the bearing of the soul. Right. And so that kind of folk music, old songs, that suddenly became kind of corny and kind of boring compared to, someone like Bob Dylan, who will, write a 20-verse song that tells you exactly what he's feeling. And you feel like he's talking to you.
Right. I mean, Bob Dylan or Laura Nero.
Yeah.
One of my personal favorites, or Joni Mitchell, but that's later on, of course. But I mean, that's more 70s, and she kills herself in 1967. That's the year of my birth, actually. So it's interesting to think about. Yeah.
Well, now Bob Dylan. I thought Bob Dylan's first album was 62. I might have.
No, I'm saying Violeta Parra kills herself in 1967.
Yeah. No, so what I'm trying to say is she did overlap with Bob Dylan. It was. Yeah, in fact, there's an article in some of the youth magazines in Chile. There's an article on Bob Dylan, another one on Joan Baez, and another one on Buffy Sainte-Marie. So they were conscious of this kind of music happening all over the world, and one on Georges Brassens, who's the French Bob Dylan.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering because I'm just trying. So in a way, so you mentioned her brother was identified with the modern.
Yeah.
There's a lot of paradoxes or things that things aren't always as they seem. So you might pigeonhole her as, because of her closeness to the Communist Party, international communism, Marxist Leninism, etc. You might think of her as the opposite of a modern, because modernism is too abstract and not engaged with the workers, right? Mm-hmm. And that's more her brother's terrain. One could say, but these categories sort of break down because she herself has modernist impulses and is experimental. Yeah. And as you said, wrote an atonal piece of music for guitar, so that even though it is guitar, then musically it's not exactly Communist Party, approved music, and in that sense. But
yeah, and one of my other themes in my book is how does she break through, given all the restrictions on her life, right? So I think that her solo show at the Museum of Decorative Arts is a wonderful example. She wants to go to the museum. she approaches the Chilean ambassador in Paris, and she wants to go to the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. MoMA. Yeah, MoMA, and she has him write a letter to the director of the Museum of Modern Art, and it's because her friends have had shows there. They were part of a group show, and I mean, who knows why, but she considered herself a modern artist, clearly, because that's her first place that she approached. And the head of the Museum of Modern Art clearly kind of, again, pigeonholes her. This is a woman who's sort of indigenous looking, and she's folkloric, and she makes embroidery, which is such a woman's craft, right? And he sends her to the museum. Instead of saying, yes, let's have a show, he sends her to the Museum of Decorative Arts, which is where you'll have furniture and crafts, which is very, so it's not the individual artist that matters, it's the form.
That's right.
And she but to show her resilience, it turns out that the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris is housed in one of the wings of the Louvrepalace. And the rest of the Louvrepalace is the Louvre Museum. So as far as she's concerned, she's having a show in the Louvre Museum because it's the same building. And, and all Chileans from then on, they all say, oh, yeah, she had a show in the Louvre. It just becomes like Violeta Parra. They don't mention the Museum of Decorative Arts. Violeta Parra had a show in the Louvre. So she completely flips it. Suddenly, the Louvre becomes the one place where she always wanted to have a show. Mm-hmm. And the Museum of Modern Art, we only know about it because we go to the archives of the Museum of Decorative Arts, and we see this letter to the first director, and we realize, oh, this is how it happened.
Well, she's someone that Violeta Parra is someone who dreamed big. She had large dreams and she has large ambitions. And to be fair, she fulfilled a lot of them. So she accomplished many things. And her accomplishments were not only public; some of them were personal. Yeah. She had a lot of radical ideas about living as a woman, as a person in the world, not just the two husbands, but She was a very free person,
Yeah.
ahead of her time.
Yeah.
I think she was free sexually and ahead of her time, and had a lot of. I think when you say she had ideas that would be popular 30 years after, only in the 70s and 80s, almost,
Yes.
way ahead of her time, and she probably was not talked about in that way. Probably was not recognized as such. I don't think, because they didn't understand her, maybe, possibly. So she's always, there's all these like innovations and all these things she's doing.
Well, two different people describe her as a hippie before there are hippies. So the word hippie is not even around. And literally, it's true. I mean, she in Paris, she convinces, she takes the money she got from selling her art at the Museum of Decorative Arts, the exhibit, right? And she buys I mean, this is so hippie. She buys a VW van, right?
Yeah,
and she lives in it. It's she that's how she goes all around Europe, and she's got it set up so she can cook, and she's got all her art there, and she keeps on getting all of these parking tickets in Paris because there's no overnight. Anyway, it's a terrible mess.
Are there any photos of her van that are existing?
No, I wish there was. There's a beautiful description by her son in one of these books.
Wow.
And so he just describes it. It's in my book as well.
Yeah, that's right.
But it sounds just like a hippie van. That's what it sounds like.
With curtains.
Yeah. I could try to find it, but I don't think there's an entry for a van in the index.
No. But it's just so fascinating, because again, reading your book, it's a history also it's actually a global history in a way.
Uh-huh.
Of those years.
Yeah.
So one could read your book as a global history of what was going on from the 40s, the post World War II, I think up till 1970. You could there's a lot in, you can look at it and like, wow, you can see the connections of things. And I don't know. I don't know if that was necessarily your goal.
Well, no, I did take a transnational approach. So this is not the first biography of Violeta Parra, but it is the first in English. And most of the biographies, there's three sort of major biography. There's three biographies. I wouldn't call them. One is major. One is more, I shouldn't say major. One is more substantial. There's three biographies written by her in Chile. But in Chile, there's the assumption that everyone knows something about her, including the myths. So it becomes a conversation among Chileans very much. Right. And I tried in my book, there are things about Chile and Chilean culture, like you mentioned, this música típica, the kind of music they were playing in the bars in the 40s. Right. I have to explain that to other people, not just even English speakers, but Mexicans or people that don't know
what it is,
how Chilean culture works. So there's a lot of that kind of trying to bring you into her world and make it accessible in this book. But the other thing that I think is I take a very transnational approach, because she was a transnational artist. That's and right. So I was able and fortunate to be able to travel to Paris, and I, actually during COVID, which was an amazing experience, wow. I was able to communicate with people all over the world who were really, I think we all wanted to engage and connect so badly that, I mean, I just, people would send me documents. Normally they would scan documents that normally they would not do, because I was supposed to go visit the archive, but they know I couldn't. So there was so much, I have, she went and played in a world festival in Finland, and they sent me the document showing that she won first prize for authentic dancing. Right. So people were so incredibly helpful, and I felt so it's very much a transnational project as well. Like I have a website, which is very fun. I think it's fun. It's new. I have the website because I have the book, but that's my name. It's Ericka Verba, ERICKAVERBA.
Right.
.com. But one of the things that I do is there's a map on it of all the places that all of the archives that I researched in, both physically and virtually. And it's really all over Europe and Latin America.
Well, that's definitely that's definitely a goal that you had, to be transnational, that it cover those years. I'm wondering though, in you're published in North Carolina, correct? It's yes. North Carolina Press.
University of North Carolina, yeah.
So I'm do you mind talking a little bit about your personal journey with this, or at least your biography, in terms of you said you described yourself as an historian. When did you become an historian, and when did you know that you said, this is what I want to do? Was there what?
Oh my goodness. Well, I was a musician way before I was a historian. Oh. I think the historian part, I mean, I think I'm well suited to be a historian, because I'm a collector. And when I was in a band, I was in one of the bands I was in I was touring, and I was the keeper of the scrapbooks. And now the scrapbooks are really like, we did a lot of solidarity work with people in Central America. Now you can use those scrapbooks sort of to piece together this movement, right? So I'm pretty obsessive, I would say. So that's very good for historians, I think, because we're really trying to figure it out. Not good for writing books quickly. I've spent decades on this book, but it's good for I think, fact checking. But so my first introduction to Violeta Parra was actually as a teenager. You mentioned you were born in 1967. I was born in 1960. So when I was in high school, the coup happened when I was in high school, freshman year. And so that was the coup, the military coup that brought down this socialist experiment of only 3 years. Salvador Allende was the president. He was a pediatrician, a good man. And, he was killed. Thousands of people were killed and disappeared. So that happened in September 11th, 1973 was the date of the coup. And a year later, I'm in high school. I'm in the suburb of Boston. It's kind of dull.
Oh, really?
And this family shows up, and they're the most interesting people, as far as I'm concerned, in Brookline. They have the father's has a grant to study radical pedagogy. The mother's an actress, and she's starring in the play The Mother by Bertolt Brecht. She's the mother. And the kids, my age, are musicians and artists. And Miguel, who's my age, he's in my class. He's also furious because he's been uprooted from his home, because they're burning books in his country, because they're disappearing people, and no one in my high school knew. We vaguely knew there was a Vietnam War. The draft was over. No, we knew there was a Vietnam War, but we had no idea that the CIA had funded a coup in Chile. Nothing. And so my musical awakening and sort of my political awakening and my artistic awakening all really happened around this family in high school. And I learned my first Violeta Parra songs from Miguel, and we're still friends. He insists that I taught him how to play guitar. I say he taught me how to play guitar. So I think that basically there were two stubborn teenagers teaching each other how to play guitar. And it really, that changed my life. I mean, I went to college. I began playing music with other people, Latin American music. And then at one point they said in college, you can't come back to school unless you declare your major. And I realized I was majoring in Latin American studies. And, some 40 years later, is it 40 years later? Probably a little more than 40 years later, I'm director of Latin American studies at Cal State LA. So it's, it's just a big continuum. And I've just finished writing a biography of Violeta Parra. So it's all connected.
It is all connected, but the music was there first.
Yes, the music was there first.
I would say for you, music and politics or activism, because of
absolutely. In fact, in 96, which was fun because we just kind of redid it for my book launch. But in 96, well, before I was still in grad school, so I wasn't a working historian yet. I put together a concert of Violeta Parra's, a tribute to concert to Violeta Parra. We got a grant from the we got a grant from the Los Angeles Cultural Affairs Department, 14 musicians, 21 songs. And actually, you can see all of this on my website. I'm working with, which I'm very happy, I'm working with a publicist, because I wrote a book and I have no idea how to tell people about it. So anyway, she suggested that I put a timeline on my bio, because I really do go back to high school, right? But with my connection to Violeta Parra goes back to high school, and so you can see all of this. You can see the concert, you can see our book launch, where 8 of the 14 musicians 30 years later came together and played at my book launch, and it was fantastic. It was great.
Well, people do need to go to your website. I should say it's hard to believe it's so new, because it's a beautiful website.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I'm so excited. One last thing about the website that I'm very excited about is, if you buy the book, or if you read the book, you can take it out of the library. I don't care how you get it. The website has a playlist. If you have Spotify, you'd have to have Spotify. But it has a playlist where you can literally listen to all of the songs that are mentioned in the book in order, and you can find them. It's like set up by chapters. Yeah.
So did you form it, because you're in Los Angeles? I'm thinking about historians, drawn a blank, City of Quartz.
Yes. Mike Davis.
Are you a Mike Davis fan? Do you know Mike Davis? Or
Mick Davis actually mentions my program, the Latin American Studies program, in his book because he studied there with Tim Harding. And I actually played in a band with Tim Harding's kids, so it feels very connected. You know, he's passed on. He was much too young. I never met him personally, but he's totally connected to the program that I.
Because he's an historian of Los Angeles.
Yes, an amazing historian of Los Angeles.
Yeah, and also the people associated with the journal. Does this exist anymore? Radical History.
Yes, Radical History. One of my colleagues on the editorial board, Ericka Ochoa. So yeah, and Heidi Tinsman, who's read my book. Yeah.
It's interesting talking about this journal and these people about the where we stand today. Of course, that's a would always be a difficult discussion, right? To say where to go or from here. It's always a question, right? Where we find ourselves, it's in other words, we live in whereas all of us are historical creatures.
Yeah.
You are, I am. We live in history. And we find ourselves in a moment, and things just change, right? And you have to.
Well,
yeah.
I guess some of the things that I'm thinking about, because we had a book launch. My book launch was scheduled for January 25th, 2025. I was playing with musicians that I met with in college. Three of us so we've been playing together again. So I went to college in 76. So three of the 9 musicians have been playing. 4 of the 9 musicians have been playing together and known each other for over 76. I can't even do the math. It's like almost 50 years, right? Is that true? 30. Yeah. I mean, when we hit 26, we'll be 50 years, right? So you're 1 year shy of 50 years of playing music together, which is really an accomplishment. And I should say I went to college very young. I was 16, so I'm not that old. But anyway, and it turns out that of those musicians, 3 had our birthdays that week.
Wow.
One was my personal birthday. It's January 20th, which was also Inauguration Day. So there's that happening. And we are in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was in the middle of the fires. And 2 of the 9 musicians lost their home.
That's right.
In the fires. And we put together, I got a text on Tuesday from Gary saying, we're evacuating. Don't worry. We have our instruments for the concert in our car. Wow. And none of us expected that 5 hours later they would not have a home. So they lost all the other instruments. He had 9 keyboards. He had a Hammond organ. So one of the things we did right away was to organize a GoFundMe so we could buy them their amps so they could use them in the concert.
Yeah, I have to.
But the other thing is, so that was on a Tuesday, and on Saturday we were supposed to rehearse. And I asked Libby, "Do you want to rehearse?" And they did, and they wanted to rehearse. And that was like the part of. I'm going to start crying probably, but at the book launch, the last song we did, of course, was "Gracias a la Vida," thanks to life, and we invited everyone to sing. And I had tuned down my D for the song before, so I had this moment where we're about to sing, and I'm supposed to start the song, and I realized that I'm tuning up a string. And so what people do on stage when other people are suddenly caught, having to do something, is usually they fill in. So there was a silence, and Libby took that moment to say that she and Gary had lost everything in the fire, and they really had. They took 1 car. They didn't realize they weren't coming back, so they really lost everything. They didn't even have 2 carfuls of people. They had of stuff. They only had the instruments they were using for the concert. So she lost other beautiful handcrafted guitars, a jarana. She only brought the guitars she was using in the concert. Anyway, and she said that rehearsing had brought her joy. That had been a moment of joy and respite from the hard stuff. So, I think that, many of us, I would say, are horrified at the idea that children that are hungry are no longer going to get aid because a billionaire is in charge. I mean, I'm going to be very blunt about my politics. I find that I don't understand how a billionaire has the right to take away food from starving children. I don't understand this. And I mean, I'm just thinking of a column in the New York Times that I read today. That's, was sort of once on that theme. And it's like, you go, yeah, why is that happening? And in a world that feels very, very cruel right now, and very almost like intentionally cruel, because I live in Los Angeles. My university has more undocumented students than any other probably university in the country. And, we don't know the number, obviously, because we can't, but, the fear in people, but also the courage in people. I have students who wear shirts. I mean, it's just, anyway, the courage, the fear, the community, the love, the fear, this dance that we're doing. I think coming together and honoring other brave people in the past, and creating community and creating joy, and expressing, her song Gracias a la Vida talks about the two materials that make up my song, and she defines them as joyfulness and sorrow. And to be able to come together and express our joyfulness and sorrow in this moment, I think is just really important, because part of me was thinking, how can I even have this celebration? Because it is a celebration when you finish something that you've worked on so hard, and your friends come together to support you, and your neighbors are cooking for everybody, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful moment of celebration, and you go, how could we be celebrating this week? But we did celebrate, and I'm happy we did. I think we need to remember how much joy music can bring us in these times.
I mean, I would call some of those things, all those things, necessities. They're not.
Yes, necessities. Beautiful.
We have to redefine. We were very, not to get too polemical on my part, but we're not doing a very good job of deciding what we hold in common, or what humans, and that the kinds of things we're talking about now, fire and water and these elements, and purity of water, and flood, and these kinds of things. These are universal things. Being on earthbound humans, that's what we share in common is very important.
We are connected. We truly are.
We can act like we don't share it. We could try to pick favorites, and that could be quite evil when people do that, actually. Yeah. So when you choose favorites, and which is what's going on now, people trying to run people's lives and all that, the rest of it. But you've been in California a long time now. How long?
Yeah. I'm funny because I'm an academic brat. So back in the day, when academic brats were kind of like military brats, we moved around a lot. And so by the time I hit high school, when I hit high school at 13, that was the 5th place that I was living in.
It's interesting that you passed through Brookline. As you know, I lived in Boston for 38 years.
Oh, wow.
I know Brookline very well. But you know a different Brookline before me. The 60s Brookline, sounds like, right?
Well, I didn't get there till 73.
Oh, okay.
So, but yeah, I lived in, I don't know if you know Corey Hill, but we lived at the top.
Oh, yeah.
It was still in all of Boston. So I got strong.
Right. But going from Brookline to Los Angeles is a big change. I mean,
it was. I followed my band.
Your band told you where to go, right?
Yeah, our band moved to LA. So I went there, and I was going to stay for at the time it was like, first of all, we didn't know the band would, stay together, and LA was pretty polluted, so people made fun of you if you moved there, because why would you do it?
Right.
And
well, in the 70s, there were a lot of stereotypes. As I said before on the show, I love LA. I love Los Angeles, actually, and there's a lot of unfair prejudice.
Yeah. No, I ended up coming here in 1982, and I moved
in that period of time. If anything you could say that comes into your conscious about what was it like gigging in Los Angeles in the 70s, or if that's what
we got here in 82. So our first tour to Los Angeles was in 1980. It was really interesting. We were very much part of a solidarity movement with Central America. So that I was in a band called Sabia. Maybe we had 10 minutes of fame. So if people have heard of Sabia, that would be my band. And we were, we did a lot of benefit concerts. We did a lot of and some of the more well-known artists were also involved in solidarity work. So I have, I was part of a music festival where Bonnie Raitt played. Right. I got to meet her, and she, the Herbie Hancock did another one. People were very conscious of what the money, U.S. dollars, again, were going towards very brutal military regimes, and people were pretty upset about that. So they tried to stop it. And musicians were very active. Jackson Brown's another one. He wrote some fantastic songs about it.
That period of time brings back a lot of memories. So when you talk about 82, 84, 85, those years, I think a lot about Sandinista and the Clash, and and I think about Sandino, the Sandino movement, and El Salvador, and I'm sure you were, and also a lot of us fought against Reagan, and that period. And remember, No Nukes? That was the whole Jackson Brown and No Nukes.
They all came together. There was a survival fest in Los Angeles, and everyone came together. So interestingly, so we went to Nicaragua in 83. We played for the Cultural Workers of the Revolutions Association. But we also went to refugee camps in Honduras of Salvadoran refugees, and we recorded their songs. And I think you would have been fascinated. Maybe we should have a whole other thing on that, because we were recording songs. It was like Violeta Parra. We were recording songs by people who had just learned how to read and write in the camps. So they had the most rich oral tradition you can imagine, and they were writing songs about their own experiences. They were survivors of 2 massacres that are very famous, where the one is Rio Lempa, the river Lempa, and the other is the river Sempul. They went down to the river, which was on the border of Honduras, and as they tried to cross, the Honduran army kept them there, and the Salvadorian army strafed them with machine guns. These are women and children, right? And so there are thousands. There was a refugee camp of 10,000 people who were survivors of these massacres, and they were writing songs. And some of the songs were about trauma. They were like the massacre of June 19th, which is when their little hamlet was attacked. And they're all about that, so they're kind of like how you release the trauma of what has happened to you. But others were, one of the songs that we just was so important was called A Song to Ronald Reagan, Canción a Ronald Reagan. And it was a woman singing, and it made you kind of like, she thought Ronald Reagan was a real person, not the president of the United States. And she said, you have children, you love them. Think how we feel when we see our children killed. And it was literally this, I have a picture of her. She's wearing a t-shirt and a skirt. She's holding 2 of her babies. She's a campesina. She's a peasant woman, who learned how to read. Maybe she doesn't know how to read or write yet, but she can tell stories through her songs. And she's appealing to the most powerful man on the world at the time. To stop bombing her towns. It was an amazing experience. I would love to share that with you more. So I guess I'm a little
memories because of those years, almost talking with you now, almost like it's this morning. So these things, it just really brings me back to that time.
Yeah.
It's remarkable to think that you were a gigging musician in those years. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That you got to experience that.
I know you're a musician as well. Were you also gigging?
Yes, but I'm late. Not that time. In other words, later. I still. Well, I would have been 13, 14, just different. That's what I mean. It's like I'm just thinking about those times and those years. And my style of music is very different. I don't sing. I do instrumental music. I don't sing. I don't do folk music. But it's just to live through that, and then you come out the other end, and then you find yourself. You're in Los Angeles, and you're that's quite a journy.
Yeah. I feel this has been a very emotional month for me. It's been very accumulating, because I can really look at everyone and see how they're still part of my life. And also I don't know if you know, but I'm also was widowed very young. So and my late husband was the bass player in our band. So it's also very poignant time, because the longer you live, the more dead people you know. What can you do?
That's how it works.
Yeah, it really is.
That's how it works. I guess that's the thing.
Yeah.
But that's your book is a new book, right? Relatively.
Yes, it just came out. January 15th was its release day. Yeah.
It's always great to have somebody on that has written a book that's brand new, come out with something brand new, and the thing that was done is going to just explode.
I hope so. I mean,
like me, again, I knew a little bit because of the things I talked about for my best, but I didn't know all that's in this book.
Yeah.
Again, I learned an enormous amount.
Oh, thank you. That makes me very happy.
I did not know. I surely didn't know all this stuff about, this figure on horseback or riding a horse and talking to all these people. And you have photographs in the book, and it's kind of really something.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, because it's you get nervous when I care so much. It's like, what if I'm the only one who does? But it turns out a lot of people have been telling me that they're happy that they know about it now. So that's good. So hopefully we'll inspire some other people to go out and get the book and read it and find out more about this woman. So because she's really, really remarkable. And once she's in part of your life, then you get to have her as part of your life and kind of the soundtrack. So it's always that's
soundtrack nice. Of life is good. What we could pick what the soundtrack is. It might be her. It might be her song. Guitar writing. Yeah. Really great guitar composer. Actually,
oh, incredible.
Actually, classical guitarists perform her repertoire.
Yes. No, it's Yeah.
It's part of the repertoire now.
Yeah. She's really remarkable. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine that one person did all of these different things. I would say that's
Yeah,
really
it's unusual. It's
hard to
unusual.
fathom. Yeah.
Well, the word genius does apply in this case. It's one
Yeah,
of
I
those
think it does.
where it does. As we even good things come to an end, like this
Yeah.
episode. Is there anything that it's off the top of your head now? You've already said many eloquent things just now, but is there anything you want to say in closing that's on your mind that's important to you?
Well,
That,
I think I would share that because we didn't really touch on her. We talked about her politics sort of as transnational movements, but she was had an incredible sense of what's right and wrong, and of social justice, and she was really. You started by saying she was a historian, which is true, but one of the there's a Chilean musicologist. Juan Pablo Gonzalez, he describes her as a social geographer. So she really was good at describing sort of the injustices of her times, you know, and I think I want to stress that her music still means something to people. That student movements sing her songs, that feminist movements in Latin America sing her songs, and that I think in times like when we're just trying to find our way. It's good to have sources of inspiration and also realize that, you know, it sounds strange, but we're not alone also in terms of like we have shoulders we can stand on, and we have people who have gone through really, really hard things before us. And I'm sure people will go through very hard things in the future. And there's this sort of this sense of community, if that makes any sense, with other people and other places and other times. What you said about the connection, that we can feel connected to people who have had very different lives than our own. I think, including ones who are already dead, if that's possible. You know, that kind of, because maybe it gives us the courage to also think about the future generations and how we're connected to them. So it feels very much like, I love what you said about connection, and you know, we're all on this planet, and you know, we happen to intersect at this very moment historically, but you know, there's many people came before and after, so we're all connected.
Yeah, I really feel that, and I'm glad that you express that on this very episode, and it means a lot to me. And I hope people buy this book.
No, thank you.
and listen to the music, as I said, not just the songs, but also the instrumental, the guitar, writing, and find out about this remarkable person.
Yes, I would love that.
And I want to thank you for your generosity of time, especially now that you are in California. I'm really thankful we can be here and talk like this.
Yes, no, I really appreciate it too. It's been really lovely to meet you, Mitch.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate your show.
Thank you very much.
All right.